Welcome to the annual Slomoff Lecture. I'm Darren Q, and I'm chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here to this event. Today we are here to honor our friend and colleague, Professor David Matz, on the 30th year of the founding of the Conflict Resolution Program. So we're going to start off with a few words in celebration of David, but also we're here today to celebrate you. So much of what this program has been about is about you and the work that you have done, our alumni, our students, and our friends. And so I want to say more about that in a minute. You're also going to hear a little bit more about Ben Slomoff, on whose behalf we are here and who we have named this annual lecture after. But first, let's hear from our chancellor, who is going to welcome the event. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. This is a wonderful, wonderful evening. I've been able to come up and I've spent my time in each of the ballrooms, and I end up here in such a wonderful space. How are you, David? Good to see you, man. I'm grateful to have you here. Thank you, Darren, for all that you continue to do and that you're going to do for us, and we're so grateful for the opportunity to just watch you continue to thrive and grow and develop here at the university and develop all these traditions, and so thank you for that. Welcome, everybody, to this Commonwealth's capital city, student-centered urban public research university, University of Massachusetts, Boston. We're so grateful for the opportunity to host you tonight. It's an honor to host an event that's been here since 2000. You know, for nearly 2 decades, the Sylvia and Benjamin Slomoff Lectureship has brought experts in the field of conflict resolution to our campus, which is extremely important for us and for this university to consider that we consider right now to be the most diverse in this great New England. I've just had a chance to hang out with Ben in San Francisco, David, and he's doing as wonderful as ever. We had a great time together, and so he looks forward to hearing all kinds of reports on this series, and we're grateful for that. It's an honor for us to welcome our guest speaker this evening and join the ranks of many other esteemed speakers who visited this university. Thank you for being here. We're so grateful for that. Our goal is to build bridges and to reduce conflict around the world, and it's something that we've been at for quite a bit of time. Tonight is even more special, as we also celebrate 30 years of conflict resolution at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Now, that's truly an incredible feat for a higher education institution, particularly for one like us that's just celebrated its 50th year. So we're about 51 now, and we've been doing this for 30 years, and so we're so grateful for that. We owe much of the success to all that we do in this field, to a peace builder, a mentor, and a scholar who we're honoring tonight with a new fellowship named in his honor. David Matz is here. 30 years ago, David first established a graduate certificate program in dispute resolution to teach negotiation and mediation training to mid-career professionals. Today, we're so proud that over 400 alumni traverse the globe with the skills they learned at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The David Matz Fellowship is one more way in which we can engage more students and alumni in this important work. Today, our university serves more than 17,000 students from 150 countries around the world, speaking more than 90 different languages. 48% of our total student body are minorities, and 12% of our student body are international students. Those numbers have nearly tripled in the last few years, and we're very proud of that here. Why does that matter? Here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, just by coming to campus and making new friends, our students learn to engage with people of all backgrounds. Many of our students take these lessons many steps further. They work to spread goodwill in our communities and around the world, largely with the guidance of mentors in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, and others. And so I wanted you to have a chance to see all these pictures behind me while I did this welcome to you as I did that. Here in Boston, for example, our Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development works with youth and families to stop violence and restore and pursue restorative justice and mentorship for incarcerated adults. Our other students have completed projects about Boston's court order busing decision 40 years ago to improve cross-cultural relationships today. Abroad, we are very proud of the good work that David and others do to spread peace in Israel, in China, and here in Boston, for example. He and other members have worked with peace building and mediation groups to help reduce conflicts. Other faculty and students have used international exchanges about human health in Honduras, Bangladesh, and other countries to promote diplomacy. I know you're going to learn much more about our efforts when our Provost Winston Langley and David Cash have the opportunity to speak to you shortly. But I'm so grateful to both of them for making our engaged scholarship in peace and conflict resolution a top priority. I also want to thank the Anniversary Committee, who worked so hard to organize this event in recognition of everything the University of Massachusetts Boston has done in the field of conflict resolution over the past 30 years, especially Benjamin Slomoff, the honorary chair, and our incredible alumnus, for whom this lecture is named. This evening celebrates the dream we all have to make our world a more peaceful place for our children and for our children's children. I hope you will use this lecture and this reception to get to know some of your friends and colleagues in this important work we all value and share. Thank you again for joining us here at the University of Massachusetts Boston. Have a pleasant evening, and I'm sorry, Dean, if I've sort of made all this start functioning behind me, but I thought I was on stage at Boston Garden or something in a concert, and I wanted to have some background to my presentation today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Chancellor. David has a lot of friends on campus, so we have a few folks that wanted to say a few words tonight. I'd like to welcome our Provost, Winston Langley. Thank you.
I think when I reflect on David's tenure here, I think in terms of the long and distinguished career of attempts on the part of human beings to find non-coercive modes by which conflicts or disputes, as it was called earlier, might be resolved. And we cannot thank him outside the context of that history. It has not been entirely successful, but it has progressively made inroads on those who think that coercion ought to be the path human beings should pursue in resolving disputes or conflicts. If one comes towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, I think one could say that among the most important achievements was the creation of a court of arbitration, seeking as its principal objectives avoiding conflicts between and among states, the coercive conflicts. It had not succeeded as originally envisioned. And after World Wars I and II, it was understood that never again applied to the continuation and the visiting on human beings of the shame of war as we had come to know it. And so a particular chapter was created in the United Nations Charter, seeking to suggest that only as a last sad resort should human beings ever again resort to war. Instead, Article 33 indicate that in any dispute, the continuation of which is likely to result in war, the continuation of which is likely to result in war, every country is legally obliged to seek resolution by means other than warfare. That has not been done. It has not been pursued. David knows, however, that one does not simply wish into being something. For those who have come to know him, he doesn't like many embroideries at all. He likes to go directly to things. And so part of what he sought to do was to create an academic program that would create leaders who might help us put in motion, put into effect Article 33, that we should use negotiations, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, all as a means to resolve difficulties. In that, he has succeeded. And there are many graduates, as the Chancellor indicated, to be found in many different parts of the world. When I think of him, I think of an effort we are putting into being now, a committee that is being constituted to expose our students to a major in law, not a law degree, that will look at law from many different standpoints. The nature of evidence that we use as we seek to claim truth on our own sides. Its role in issues of legitimacy. Its role in what we have come to call justice, however defined, if you wish. Its role in conflict resolution. I think of him in terms of the book of Micah, 6 verses 8. What is required of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. In war, there is no time to reflect. And in absence of reflection, there can be neither justice nor mercy. And so, to the extent there is a third party that can be brought in to look at what might be a source of conflict and to create an environment, what is called a cooling off period, during which a resolution may be had, we might have a chance for justice and for mercy. He is somebody who understands human misery and the part it plays in human conflict. And this is expressed very well. And I'd like to read something for you from one of the classics in the West. It's something we call the Iliad, and which a woman, Simone Weil, saw as a poem of force. And that's what it is. If you recall, after Troy was wrecked, destroyed, many, many, many hundreds of thousands slaughtered, King Priam sought to appeal to the leader of the Greek army, Achilles. And as he approached the tent of Achilles, this warrior, this ultimate slaughterer, couldn't believe that this king was approaching him and perhaps seeking some mercy for Hector, who had been killed. And I read this to you. He, Priam, spoke, the author remembering his own father, longed to weep but could not. Taking the old man's arm, he pushed him away. Both were remembering, thinking of Hector, killed and the killer of men. Priam wept, abased at the feet of Achilles. And Achilles wept, now for the first time, remembering his own father. Now remember his friend Patroclus. And their sobs resounded through the house as both men wept. They did not even know that they were going to weep. It is the moment that had overcome them. Sometimes we move in the direction of violence and slaughter, despite what we sometimes feel. We cannot even control ourselves. So the idea of a third party intervening to give us a chance to reflect on ourselves is something that should be rendered sacred in our societies. And so, when I remember David, I remember Neve Shalom, the attempt to create a college where Arabs and Jews, Palestinians and Jews, might learn together, might come to know one another better, might understand some of the reasons why in moments of non-reflection we do what we do, and that the societies we plot for our future, individual and collective future, will be ones in which the idea of justice is linked to the idea that we need a pause if we are going to deal with the horrors of war and the horrors of warfare. Thank you, David, for your contributions to the university, for your contributions to the students, to the program we have in the McCormack School, to what we may have in the future, and in how we shape the world of that future.
Thank you, Provost Langley. Thank you. I'd like to welcome to his first Slomoff lecture our new dean, David Cash. Welcome.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Chancellor, for your words. And I will say this is the second time today that I've had to follow the Provost with his lofty and intense and beautiful language. And again, I have to follow someone who quoted the UN Charter, the Bible, and the Iliad. Not fair. What a wonderful evening, what a wonderful full auditorium to honor Ben Slomoff and to honor David. There's been a lot of discussion about his part that he's played here at the university in beginning these programs. And I want to talk a little bit about the impact he's had, as we have heard, globally on peace in the Middle East, in China, in this area. But I think one of the testaments to how incredible he's been in this community is to what he's done with students. We were able to see a couple of photos of students, but those are just a small, small fraction of the students that he has interacted with. It's probably thousands over the years. And I just want to quote a little bit. It's not from the Bible or the Iliad. It's from the course evaluations that he gets. And there, usually there's a quantitative piece where faculty are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the best, on all kinds of criteria, things like quality of learning experience, instructor was well organized, instructor presented, et cetera. You've all taken these. And I just want to read the scores here. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 4.86. In your AFR, we will be discussing this. You're slowing down a little bit, David. And there are opportunities for the students to comment, a written comment. And I just want to get a couple of them succinctly. And again, remember, this is one class he's taught here. So you can imagine if you read these over 30 years plus, what you would be hearing. Here's one. The man knows his stuff and pedagogically engages students to interact with themes and topics covered. The best class ever. I loved it. And then along those themes, so class or teacher, we're not sure. Best teacher ever. I don't know, class, teacher, which one? But it's a testament, David, to how you have touched people. I find it quite an honor to speak here tonight because I will bet I probably know David the least of probably everybody in this room. And it was interesting. In my first weeks here last summer, I was keeping lists of people I had to talk to, and your name came up time and time and time again. And David was nice enough to meet me at a diner in Jamaica Plain and introduced me to some of the best huevos rancheros I've ever had. So I appreciate that. But then I was nervous about this, right? Here I am, the new dean, sitting down with this guy who there's such enormous respect for, who everybody's talking about his integrity, and I was nervous. And immediately you put me at ease. Immediately we were laughing about something, I don't know what. And immediately I was incredibly impressed with the incredible things that the Chancellor and the Provost have spoken about. So again, thank you so much for all that you've done. It's fantastic that we have launched this, and I know this will be a huge success like everything that you've done here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Cash. Please go ahead. So we'll be getting to our guest speaker in just a moment. We just had a couple more things we wanted to do in recognizing David, one of which is to have a few words from the co-founder of the Conflict Resolution Program, who can't be with us today, but being technologically savvy, has sent a few words of welcome.
Hello, David and gathered friends. I am saddened that I cannot attend this honor for you, David, in person. One of the reasons I'm saddened is it would probably be far easier for me to generate laughs at your expense if I were there in person. but I will just have to do my best remotely. David, you and I have been partners in ventures together continuously since 1973, when you hired me into the Law Center of the College of Public and Community Service, CPCS, at UMass Boston, and of course through the founding and early years of the graduate programs in dispute resolution, and now in our work together at the mediation group. I don't want to count out loud, but in not too many years, you and I could actually be celebrating our golden anniversary. I think it's wonderful that all of the rest of you are honoring David, and especially with a fellowship in the graduate program. I think it's particularly appropriate for two reasons. And now I hope I have David smiling that I'm not saying three reasons as I usually do. But Darren did tell me that I had to be brief. The first reason is that David is a founder and builder of institutions extraordinaire. From his work in the early days of Hampshire College, to the formation of the Law Center at CPCS, to the founding of the graduate programs in dispute resolution, to the nurturance of those programs, to the growth of the mediation group, and then now to the launch of the Peace College in Neve Shalom. David's initiative and perseverance and brilliant sense of what works built those organizations into strong and vibrant institutions. Frankly, I don't know anybody more creative or determined in bringing about places which reflect excellence while holding strongly to the values of their constituents. The second reason that creating this fellowship in David's name is so appropriate is that it will serve students, and David has had an extraordinary impact on so many. His teaching, of course, has been remarkable, but also when he built those various educational institutions, his eye was always on the experience for students. And what no doubt many in this room may know a small part of, David has in countless situations with individual students, whether in times of crisis or just plain career counseling, he has been a special mentor for generations. So, creating a fellowship in David's name in this institution, and one that will serve students for years to come, strikes me as fair turnaround. It's a perfect and lasting tribute to him and a hallmark for UMass Boston. Congratulations.
As many of you who know David well as I do, know how much he loves faculty meetings, committee meetings, and other such things. And over the years, I think academia in general across the world, certainly there's been more and more pressure for academics to churn out the journal articles and to spend a lot of time thinking on the research side, as we should. But throughout my years here, I've always been impressed how David, again and again, when we get through some sort of meeting somewhere, stops and says, but what about the students? And I think this, in so many ways, for me, sums up David's legacy with us here, is that David, from the very beginning, has taught the entire department, and I would say certainly he's been a model across campus, that the reason we're here is about our students. This is our mission, and this is how, in the end, we will be judged. And so we thought, what better way to honor what he's done and what he's taught us in so many different ways than to set up a fellowship in his name. And David, in his usual way, when we told him that, he said, so what are you going to do with the $2.38 that you raise? And I'm happy to tell you that as of this point, you and others out there have raised over $60,000 in David's name. I would like to thank the alumni committee that helped to bring this about. That's Meta Kreutzmann, Karen Richards, Helen Barrington, Chris Brody. I'd like to also thank Kelly, Lee, and Ronnie in our office. We're going to say more about them in a minute, but to thank all of you for making this possible. And I started off by saying that this is a celebration of you. You're the reason that we're here, and what has always made this program strong has been the students and the alumni. And not just what you do with us, but just as important or more important, what you do when you leave us. And I am here today to say that we still need you. We need your good ideas. We need you to engage with us. We need you to help send students in our direction to come take classes with us. We need your energy, and we need your help. And so this today is really an effort on our part to try to re-engage the alumni and the students that are currently with us when you move on to the next thing, to stay with us, to be part of this community of conflict resolution, human security, and global governance, which has started under David's vision and has been around for 30 years, and we're looking forward to another 30 years, at least, of excellence on this part. So stay engaged, please connect, and we're planning to do something for the alumni around the Slomoff event every year. So I'd like you just to sort of circle this time of year on your calendars and say, around this time of year, check in with us, and we're going to be doing something for you like we did today with Professor Anthony Juanice St. John, who had a fabulous workshop on organizational conflict. So check in and check us out. I would like to just take a moment to honor as well Ben Slomoff, whose kindness is the reason we've been able to do these lectures every year. Ben is a former student of David's. He is now clocked 102 years old, and he sent a letter to David, and I just would like to read it briefly. At my 100th birthday party in California, Professor David Matz told over 100 family members and guests that I was not a traditional student and that I violated standard protocols. He was right. Whenever I disagreed, I would blurt it out, not bothering to raise my hand for permission to speak. I first met David when I graduated from UMass with a bachelor's degree in public and community service in 1993 at the age of 80. After completing a successful military and business career, attending Harvard Extension for several years, taking classical courses for credit, I decided to complete my education, denied by the Great Depression of 1929. With the help and guidance of Professor Marie Kennedy, I was offered a bachelor's degree at UMass, matriculating for 2 years with credit for previous scholastic training, as in command school in the military and Stanford Business School for business executives. I completed the baccalaureate degree in 2 years. Professor David was starting a master's program in conflict resolution. I applied and was rejected. I called David and asked him to meet me for lunch to plead my case. He picked a deli in Brookline. I'm seeing a theme here in today's speakers. Probably for a quick brush off. The lunch was very dry, but not half as dry as our meeting. David said, I have 16 places and they're all filled, mostly from young executives who can use the training in their companies. You are retired. What do you intend to use the training for? I said, I don't know yet, but I assure you that I'm a serious student and you won't regret it if I am accepted into the program. I will never know why David finally decided to accept me. Probably a dropout or prescience. I decided to write my final paper on the Hamlet conflict with his stepfather, the king. I was taking a year of Shakespeare with Professor Marjorie Garber at Harvard simultaneously with my master's program. When I handed in my paper, which I thought was a classic, David said, "What's this?" When I explained, he said, "I assign thesis papers, and this is not acceptable." I finally did a 2-hour taped interview with him. He wanted 100 questions provided by me on how I would have operated my 1,000-employee footwear manufacturing company differently after my conflict resolution master's training program. The questions were on labor, management, union problems, and what personal difficulties I encountered. Apparently, I answered them to his satisfaction because I got my master's degree in 1997 at the age of 84. I asked David what I could provide in gratitude, and he proposed a small library for master's papers and an annual symposium for worldwide religious and political conflict. In honor of my late wife, Sylvia, a symposium was created and has continued for the last 16 years, offering internationally known experts such as Ambassador Ross and the Honorable Senator from Maine, George Mitchell. Soon after graduation, I applied to FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Authority, for training in arbitration and mediation for the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. After passing their rigid regulatory exams, I became a licensed arbitrator and mediator for FINRA. The earnings from this endeavor helped maintain the symposium at UMass, which I created. In addition, I performed hundreds of mediations for the Superior Court of Contra Costa County, pro bono. I did the mediation on the air rights of the Big Dig. Mayor Menino rewarded me by declaring a Boston Ben Slomoff Day and stated no matter where I lived, I would always be an honorary Bostonian. David, you have given me a new career, and at 80 years of age, a new life. At 102, I am still doing arbitration and mediation and writing and publishing poetry. I have just published my second book of poetry, Never Enough. As a small token of gratitude, I am donating something to start the new David Matz Challenge. Thank you, Ben Slomoff. Last but not least, I would like to have one of our students, former students, alumni members, Chris Brody, come up and to say just a few words. Chris, welcome.
So as I was thinking about what I might say today, the idea of food definitely came up. Somewhere in the realm of, David claims not to be either a gourmand or a foodie, yet he knows of all the great places around Boston to eat, and better than your GPS, he can get you there and tell you where to park. So it's awesome. It's really terrific. Today has already been a real game changer, I think, for the alumni that showed up. And I'd like to, first of all, thank you for letting me share some reflections. Today has already been stimulating and rewarding to be gathered with my fellow alums, to remember the experience we once had here, and to learn together again. And now we celebrate the Conres community that David Matz has built, this community that works to create a more peaceful and productive world. We alums have taken time to connect and participate, and we are glad for this. Into the program we entered over the last 30 years, a colorful array of diverse individuals with similarly relentless optimism about making a difference in this world of conflict. David and his merry band of outstanding administrators and professors welcomed us, taught us, prodded us. Some of us needed lots of that, and listened to our struggles. To be living in a foreign land, to juggle job and school, to miss our child's musical performance, to comprehend a particularly difficult reading, Eben, and often to pay for school. Many times we students knew that the program itself would face financial challenges, and yet it was always clear that when decisions were made, David focused on students first. Another theme? To provide the learning and community we needed so that we could complete our studies and make a difference. This program supported us richly, and we are glad for it. So on behalf of the program alums, David, we congratulate you on this recognition milestone, and we thank you for your body of work that informs us, your energy that inspires us, your care that connects us, and your leadership that demonstrates how to focus ourselves in this marathon that is the road to peace. I encourage my fellow alums to promote this program wherever you can, to keep the continued success of this invaluable program in your prayers, and to honor this program in whatever way you choose to give back. David and his work remind us, each of us can make a difference, and we are glad for it. Thank you.
Quick word, okay, not my habit. First year law school, torts class, taught to me by a man named Milton Katz. Katz had been the head of the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, rebuilding Europe. He had 130 students in the class. He managed, at just about every class, to keep 100, well, felt like 100, maybe 35 hands in the air at all times, all eager to challenge him, talk to each other, keep the dialogue going at a high intensity. One day, there were about 50, 60 hands in the air, and suddenly he stopped, and he sort of froze. And all of us with our hands in the air put our hands down, and he looked up as if he'd sort of just awakened for a moment, and he said, "Can you believe it? They even pay me to do this. He's been my role model as a teacher ever since. I cannot swear that I remember everything I learned in torts that year, but I remember his enthusiasm for teaching, his enthusiasm for the students. Chris's point, his enthusiasm for making contact with 130 people in a room. That I remember in my bones. As a role model, as he is my role model, I never caught up to him. I don't think I've ever quite made it to be, but that's what the best role model is, right? The one who's always a little ahead of you. I've got just another minute. I want to use it to do some thanking. First, I do want to thank Darren. He was quite right. He saw this as a possibility to raise money for students that I did not see. I was the skeptic in the house. Yeah, Vanessa, you were too. But Darren saw that this had real possibilities, and he was right, and I want to be very grateful for that. Kelly is here somewhere, right? Can you come up, Kel? At an event like this, we are all aware that it takes an enormous amount of work to do these things, and someone has to do that kind of work with the food and the mailing lists and the emails and all that stuff. And we always thank the people who do those things, and I want to thank her for that, but that's not why I asked her to come forward. She did this job with such special passion and commitment that it just energized us all. And she did all of that without anybody saying, oh, by the way, you have an extra day in the week to work. She just did it on top of everything else. It's a small token, Kelly, but we love you for it. Thank you. The last thank you is the obvious one. I have to thank every student here. You've given me a chance to have a career in which I could do what I love to do. I can only do that with the students. You never know, a teacher never knows what students remember. I barely can remember the names of my teachers, much less what they taught me. But the fact that you've given to the fellowship, that you're here today, I'm going to make my own interpretation. That you got something that was important to you out of this program. And for teachers, that's the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Okay. A quick reminder for all of you, if you'd like a chance to hang out a bit more with David, there's going to be a dinner right after this, right next door. So stick around. Oh, we're down one floor. Yes. Thank you, Kelly. In addition to thanking Kelly myself as well, I'd like to thank Ronnie Lipton and Lee Murphy for the two of you. The three of you together know that getting faculty together is herding cats is an understatement. Thank you for making everything possible. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi is founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Professor Parsi is an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He's the author of several books, and he holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and currently teaches at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Parsi, please join us.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. and listening to the fantastic speeches and the gratitude earlier on to your professors, I've decided that I'm going to change my topic a little bit today. I was here to talk mostly about the geopolitics of the Middle East, but I realized that this is a perfect venue to talk about some amazing conflict resolution that has happened in the last 2 years that led to the Iran deal. I thought with so many people in this room who know so much more about conflict resolution, I would take the opportunity to share with you a little bit of what I've learned that has happened in the last couple of years that eventually led a situation that was very close to a military confrontation on a scale that would make the Iraq war look like the cakewalk it was promised to be, to something that actually led to an agreement, an unprecedented agreement, between the great powers in the P5+1 as well as Iran. I want to do that because I think this is something that truly shows the tremendous value and importance of conflict resolution. And I want to say that also because I believe that this deal, whether you think it's a good deal or not, I think it is a deeply underappreciated and misunderstood deal. I don't think there is a sufficient understanding of the tremendous effort that went into it and the tremendous achievement that it truly was. And I'm going to talk about that because, conveniently, I'm writing a book about it right now, and I've done more than 75 interviews counting with the negotiators from all sides, including the key people in the White House, the Iranian foreign minister, the delegation from the European Union, the Russians, etc., to patch together a picture of what actually happened. What actually was it that led a situation that was so close to a military confrontation to be resolved in the manner that it was? Let me first point out why I think this deal is something probably unparalleled. There are experts on conflict resolution in this room who probably can correct me, but I would make the argument that this is probably a rather unique situation, mindful of the following 5 criteria. Now, you now have a major global dispute. This was not a border dispute between 2 or 3 countries. This involved the entire world, as clarified by the P5+1 leading it. Secondly, it was an issue that was on the brink of war, and we know now that particularly in 2012, there were a couple of very close moments in which this could have led to a military confrontation. Thirdly, it was solved through diplomacy before it went to war. We're not talking about the usual situation in which diplomacy comes in to clean up the mess that war has created, but rather it came in before and it evaded a military confrontation. And fourthly, and perhaps most astoundingly, the solution was a genuine compromise in which, despite the fact that Iran is a mid-level country and the rest of the countries in the P5+1 are great powers, they nevertheless had to agree to meet each other halfway in order to make sure that not only there would be a deal, but it would be a lasting deal. It would be a durable deal. It would be something that would actually endure. And then the fifth thing, that perhaps is the one thing that makes it unique, because I'm sure people in this room can think of other conflicts that have been similar to this, but the fifth thing is that this was not only a conflict that was on the brink of war, resolved through diplomacy, a genuine compromise, but it has the potential of being transformative, meaning that it is not just a deal that ends a dispute. It is a deal that actually can usher in a completely different relationship between 2 countries that once used to be allies and for the last 35 years have been lethal enemies. That transformational potential has not been materialized yet, but it is there. And if it is materialized, then I think indeed history will treat and judge this deal quite positively. So how did we get here then? I remember in 2012, the then Secretary of Defense put the risk of military confrontation between Iran and the United States at 50-50. Now, this is not a pundit on Fox News. This is the Secretary of Defense saying that it could go either way. Now, we have a narrative a public narrative that says that what happened was that we imposed sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions were so crippling, they eventually cried uncle, and they came back begging to the negotiating table, and voila, we had a deal. That's the public narrative. It's a narrative that is probably quite beneficial for politicians. It is also a narrative that is not entirely true. There is a different narrative, a narrative that is much closer to the truth and probably far more complementary to those who are working in the field of conflict resolution, because it shows a completely different turn of events that eventually led to this resolution. What you had after 2010, when there was a first attempt at diplomacy during the Obama administration that did not have the significant level of political will that was necessary in order to get to a solution, is that both sides went back and they started an escalatory cycle. From the United States and its allies, we started imposing massive sanctions on the Iranians, probably the most crippling sanctions that have been imposed on any country besides Iraq itself. And the aim was to change the cost-benefit calculation of the Iranians. The aim was said to be something that would help diplomacy by making sure that the cost-benefit of the Iranians of pursuing their nuclear program would change. What it did in the immediate term, though, was quite the opposite. Just as much as the United States believed that the cost-benefit calculation of the Iranians could be changed by crippling their economy, the Iranians calculated that they could change the cost-benefit analysis of the United States and its allies by racing forward in their nuclear program in order to force the United States to eventually come to agree that Iran would have enrichment on its soil. This was the red line for the Iranians, making sure that whatever the outcome would be, they would keep enrichment on their soil, which the Bush administration had said was completely unacceptable, and the Obama administration had been rather silent on. They had not said whether that is the objective or whether it isn't the objective. 2 years into this, the Iranian economy was suffering tremendously. Obviously, it wasn't the regime that was suffering. It was ordinary people, and we know that from other cases as well, that sanctions tend to hit the weakest in society. Governments and government institutions have plenty of capabilities of circumventing sanctions. Ordinary people do not. But another thing also happened, which is that the Iranians did rush forward with their nuclear program and expanded it very aggressively. When President Obama first came into office, the Iranians had roughly 8,000 centrifuges. By 2013, they had 22,000, 19,000 of those functioning. When President Obama came into office, the Iranians had roughly 1,500 kilos of low-enriched uranium. You need about 1,200 to build a bomb. By 2013, the Iranians had 10,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium. The Iranians had also started enriching uranium at the 20% level, and they reached about 190 kilos of that. You need 250 kilos of 20% enriched uranium in order to build the bomb. The breakout capability of the Iranians, the time it would take for them to rush towards, from the point in which they've decided to rush towards a bomb to being able to have all the material for a bomb, by early 2013 was no more than 8 to 12 weeks. That was the track record of escalating pressure and the Iranians counter-escalating on their side. The end result of this was that it was quite clear to the White House, particularly to the president, that if this continued, he would be faced with a very stark choice within months of either accepting Iran having, essentially being a de facto nuclear power, or taking military action. There was a desperate need for a third way. But contrary to the belief that sanctions would bring them to the table or that it eventually would cause a boost for diplomacy, there had been no signs in the public negotiations that were continuing that the Iranians would be in any way, shape, or form flexible, particularly if there wasn't any compromise on the enrichment issue. And just as the provost mentioned earlier on, sometimes in the middle of these battles, we don't have time to reflect, and we need a third party to step in to help us reflect. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. the country of Oman, the Arabian Peninsula, had helped the United States with a prisoner swap with Iranians just 2 years earlier, releasing 3 American teachers of English and journalists. They came to be known as hikers. They hiked once, and ever since they've been known to be hikers. But they're actually very, very serious people and journalists, and they were wrongfully taken by the Iranians. They actually weren't even in Iranian territory. They were in Iraqi territory, and they were imprisoned by them. And the Omanis stepped in, and they began mediating, and after a year or so, they managed to finally deliver, and there was a prisoner swap in which a couple of Iranians held in the United States were freed, and Sarah and her 2 friends were released from Iranian prison as well. This had proven that the Omanis actually had the capacity to deliver on the Iranian side. They had the capacity to get the very complex Iranian political system to work for them, to work with them. And the Omanis in 2011 became extremely concerned that this whole thing, this escalatory cycle, was heading towards a military confrontation. And just as much as Iraq had proven to be an unmitigated disaster for the Middle East, this one would be even worse. And they tried to see what they could do to help mediate, to find a third way, an exit ramp for the United States and for Iran. Through their help, in July 2012, a secret meeting was held in Muscat, the capital of Oman, in which 2 mid-level people from the US administration and 3 Iranian diplomats, this is, mind you, in the middle of this, while Ahmadinejad is still president, meet there for about a day and a half. By all accounts, and by that I mean I've spoken to all sides of this, it was not a successful meeting. The Iranians insisted that there would be no movement whatsoever unless the United States accepted that at the end of whatever deal they make, enrichment on Iranian soil would have to be accepted. They view this as their sovereign right, and they could not give this up. This was their uncompromising red line. From the US side, they were mostly interested to see whether the people across the table actually were serious, if they had authority from Iran's supreme leader to be able to negotiate, but they had no maneuverability on the substance of the issues. Then we hit the American presidential elections, nothing happens, and then comes spring 2013. And another meeting is set up in March of that year. Despite the fact that the first meeting in Oman had been unsuccessful, at the second meeting in March 2013, the United States sends a very senior delegation instead, with Bill Burns, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, and several other senior American officials. The Iranians also send a higher level delegation. And for the first time in these talks, despite the fact that no movement had been made, the United States played the enrichment card and suggested to the Iranians that under certain circumstances, the United States was willing to accept enrichment on Iranian soil. And this opened up the entire issue. Then we got really lucky, incidentally, because then there were elections in Iran, and Hassan Rouhani was elected, who has no crazy ideas about the Holocaust, and if he does, he doesn't share them publicly. And as a result, a lot of the political problems that existed no longer were there. Rouhani had no idea about these secret negotiations. He was briefed upon them once he came into office. And immediately afterwards, the President of the United States sends a message to Rouhani congratulating him for the election victory. They have a brief conversation while they're both at the UN by phone. And negotiations begin in August of that year, in Oman first, and several of them in New York. And very quickly, by November of that year, we have a deal, an interim deal. And what was critical here was the realization that the administration knew from the very beginning, at some point they were going to play the enrichment card. But the plan all along was to play it at the end of a negotiation, not at the beginning of a negotiation. But after having tested the sanctions, and I would say that sanctions were successful insofar that they proved that sanctions are not successful, you had to go down that path to be able to see what it could not deliver. At that point, the US side played the enrichment card, which it could have done much earlier, and I'll tell you why, and what could have happened otherwise. And similarly on the Iranian side, they realized that they had to provide transparency. They had to engage in direct negotiations, bilateral negotiations with the United States in order to get any movement. Now, what is sad about all of this, even though it's a good story, what is sad about it is there were plenty of opportunities in the past in which if we only had adopted a more realistic approach, a solution could have been found much, much earlier. In 2005, in March of that year, the then UN ambassador of Iran to the United Nations, Javad Zarif, who's currently the foreign minister and the person who negotiated this deal from the Iranian side, he was back then the lead negotiator for the nuclear talks. He sent a last negotiation offer to the European side. The US at the time wasn't even at the table because the Bush administration believed that if you talk to people, you magically legitimize them, and as a result refused to engage in any diplomacy. The Iranians sent a proposal to the Europeans in which they offer to cap their enrichment program at 3,000 centrifuges. Now remember, by the time Obama comes into office, after more years of sanctions, they had 8,000. By the time the secret negotiations begin, they have 22,000. They had 3,000 at the time. They had no stockpile of low-enriched uranium. They had no knowledge of how to enrich uranium at 20%. So much of the fuse cycle they had not even discovered yet because they hadn't gone down that path. But the Europeans didn't even respond to the proposal because they knew that any proposal that was not zero, that wasn't zero enrichment, would be rejected by the US side. In the midst of the negotiations, I saw Zarif for an interview, and I asked him about that proposal. Because the week earlier, I had been at the White House, and people had said, if we could only get back to that proposal, we would jump on it in a second. And that's the sad part of this. We're constantly chasing the deal we actually could have said yes to 2 years ago. He said, oh yeah, the 3,000, but that was just an opening. I would have settled for 1,000. And it tells you that the opportunities that were missed because we had to go down the path of first trying every coercive measure we could before we tried the simplest idea of, why don't we just try a compromise? But we couldn't do so politically, neither could the Iranians, unless they had tested and tested and tested to see if they could first win by strong-arming the other side. Now, the reason why the Omanis ended up being so critical in all of this is because we have to remember there were 30 years of mistrust and animosity between the United States and Iran. One of the critical reasons as to why neither side had the political courage to try a compromise before exhausting all coercive measures is precisely because of that deep mistrust. And this is where the Omanis were so critical, because as a third party, they came in with an injection of confidence and trust, because both sides actually had really good relations with the Sultan of Oman. He played a critical role in this. Let me just give you some details of how it happened. At the second meeting in Oman, the way the US side presented the idea of accepting enrichment was still with a lot of caveats and very, very careful language. The Iranians didn't quite pick it up. After, I think, the third or the second day, the Sultan calls in the two sides separately to get a debrief. His plan was to ask the question point blank of the American side, will you accept enrichment in Iran? He never had to, because Secretary Bill Burns explained what the American position was, which made it clear that under the right circumstances, the US was now willing to agree to it. The Sultan then calls in the Iranians, and the Iranians immediately start complaining that things are going nowhere, the Americans are still not accepting it, we have no maneuverability unless we can make sure that our sovereign rights first are accepted and respected. And the Sultan said, you don't have anything to worry because the Americans have told me in clear language they will accept enrichment. Being as paranoid and suspicious as the Iranians are, they said, well, that's not enough. We need something in writing. Now, this was tricky. For the US side to put this in writing could create all kinds of difficulties. At the end of the day, this was a secret negotiation. This was not supposed to go public, and there were plenty of elements of risk there. So they found another solution. A gentleman, actually from this area, who had played a critical role in establishing the Oman Channel in the first place, happened at the time to be the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry. The solution was, and this was not unusual incidentally for the Obama 1 administration, to use John Kerry's good offices. So instead of a letter from the Americans to the Iranians saying that enrichment would be accepted under the right circumstances, John Kerry writes a letter to the Sultan explaining the American position is enrichment will be accepted under these circumstances. The Sultan then travels in between his cancer treatment to Tehran and sits down with the supreme leader of Iran, shows him the letter, and puts his own name on it and says, the Americans have promised me this. Now, will you complete these negotiations? And he gets a yes. So in the middle of all of this Arab-Persian divide, Sunni-Shia divide, was an Arab country that got the United States and Iran back together on talking terms. Now, will this last? Well, we know that there's been a tremendous amount of opposition to this deal in the United States. I think this is a context that is important to understand. This deal was strongly and warmly welcomed everywhere in the globe, with the exception of in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, and in the US Congress. Everywhere else, people were cheering and were quite happy about it. The countries that had opposition to it also had legitimate reasons to be concerned about this. It's not necessarily because they believe that this would lead the Iranians to get a nuclear bomb. On the contrary, it had very little to do with that. It had far more to do with the fact that once the United States and Iran, together with the P5+1, strike a deal, whatever the details of that deal is, it puts to an end 35 years of containment of Iran. It puts to an end a rejection of Iran being a legitimate country in the region that also needs to be included in regional decision-making. And that in and of itself, from the perspective of those who think it's the right move, is a step that essentially accepts that the balance of power in the region is such that it makes no sense to exclude a country as powerful as Iran. But from the perspective of those countries that are fearful of Iran, and particularly fearful of Iranian power, to them it means the United States is no longer going to be dedicated to a perpetual policy of containing Iran. It means that the United States is not automatically going to be on Saudi Arabia's side in every conflict or dispute it has with the Iranians, or Israel for that matter. It means a completely different configuration. And from the perspective of the president, to a certain extent, this was quite deliberate. Deliberate in the sense that in the larger perspective of the president, there is a need for a pivot to Asia. The United States is overextended and overcommitted in the Middle East. And the Middle East itself has lost significant strategic importance in the last decade for many different reasons. The cost of maintaining America's involvement at the level that it used to be is far too high anyways, and the benefits are dwindling very, very fast. And as a result, there was a need for reprioritization. But you couldn't do that unless you first made sure that you wouldn't be tripwired into a war with Iran. You needed to resolve the nuclear issue. And that would then enable you to have still a strong relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia, but perhaps a bit different. One in which the friendship with Saudi Arabia would be a bit more conditional, meaning that the United States would have the maneuverability to address many of the concerns that exist about Saudi Arabia's spread of Wahhabism and Islamic radicalism. It would mean that there also would be a little bit more tough love from the United States side towards Israel when it comes to the Palestinian issue. Maneuverability that the United States didn't have until this issue first was resolved. But from that perspective of these states, it's understandable that they were not entirely excited about the idea that this would happen. But right now, where things stand is that the deal is still there, but those who oppose it are essentially adopting the position that they believe that the Obama presidency is essentially an exception, is a parenthesis. And as soon as this president leaves, the United States will return back to the usual track vis-a-vis the Middle East. And as a result, there's not that much of a need at this point to confront this deal too much, because once you have a different president, you will have a much easier time to be able to reverse not only the deal itself, but the entire new approach towards the Middle East. And this is where things are standing right now. If that fails, and if this deal stays in place, and it is successful, and Iran's paths to a nuclear weapon are closed, but at the same time, Iran is included in the regional architecture of the region, there are reasons to believe that there are plenty of positive dividends for the region as a whole and for the United States and Iran as well. There is, in the long term, a tremendous compatibility between Iran and the United States if one is willing to look beyond the regime. I think it's quite clear that there's, without a doubt, plenty of problems with the regime, but regimes come and go. Societies endure. And the Iranian society is one that I think we should be very careful not to dismiss. We're talking about a society with one of the highest educational levels in the region, a society in which 60% of the students are female, a very, very large number of the working force are women. Although still too low, women did significant headway in the recent parliamentary elections. The values espoused by the Iranian people tend to be much, much closer to Western liberal values than what you have in the rest of the region. Now let me throw one other statistic out for you. Right now, despite the sanctions and the tremendous difficulties that were imposed on the Iranian people as a result of the sanctions, Iran's middle class still constitutes 60% of the population. If the deal is successful, and if Iran is reintegrated into the world economy, if they get their own act straight, because their main reason why sanctions did hurt them so much is because of their own mismanagement and their own corruption. But if they manage to fix all of that, then it's not completely unreasonable for the Iranians to be able to grow about 5% a year for the next 10 years. If they do so, Iran's middle class is projected to be 85% of the population by 2025. Now, a country that has 85% middle class is not guaranteed not to pursue strange policies, but it's far more likely that a country that has that big of a middle class will be pursuing status quo and stabilizing policies both internally and externally. That's the promise of the transformation that exists if this is pursued and if it is being successful. Does it mean that the United States and Iran will likely become friends anytime soon? I don't think so. There are too many other issues, and as well as ideological, whatever we want to call it, that still makes it very difficult to move towards friendship. But what you can achieve is that America may be able to lose an enemy in the Middle East. And that's been quite a while since that happened. Thank you so much. Thank you. I understand we have time for some questions, and I just called them out, right? Very good. Sorry, do you want them to speak into the mic, or what's the rules? Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm curious, you just talked about the difference between the regime and Iranian society, and the fact that regimes come and go, but societies endure. Can you speak a little bit more to how that might evolve going forward? I mean, we've been, in the last 30 and 35 years, suffered our relationships between the two countries because of the difficulties, at least in my view and perhaps several others, because of the regimes that have been in power. So how does, and certainly the Iranian society at times in the last 3 decades have tried to overcome the deficits and difficulties that the regimes have imposed. How do you see that evolving going forward such that perhaps the loss of the enmity between the two countries would develop?
Thank you. I thought it was quite clear this past summer that whenever you have a status quo that has lasted 35 years, rest assured, there are beneficiaries of that status quo. It wouldn't be enduring for that long unless someone was benefiting from it. And it was very clear, looking at what was going on in Congress and elsewhere, inside of Iran as well, that there are those who are addicted to this enmity. There are those who are fearing that this enmity would be undone. I call it an institutionalized enmity. There are plenty of people in the bureaucracies of both sides that have made fantastic careers by spending a tremendous amount of time thinking about new ways to squeeze the other side, new ways to be able to pressure the other side. And you certainly have elements inside of Iran who believe that if they undo the enmity with the United States, and if the United States would be able to once again have a presence in Iran, we currently do not, that ultimately would be the greatest threat to the regime's survival. You also have other schools of thought within the same regime who believe that the greatest threat to this regime's survival is isolation. The greatest threat to the regime's survival is that in a globalized world, in a globalized economy, Iran would be on the outside. And they want to move it, so that's where people like Rouhani, et cetera, fall into place. They want to move in that direction. One of the interesting ironies of the region is that in most countries, unfortunately, they're run by autocratic regimes. But if they were to go, most likely they would be replaced with probably even more radical regimes because their societies are more radical than their regimes. Iran is one significant exception to that rule, in which the society is far, far more progressive than the regime is. And the regime is constantly trying to survive, despite the fact that when the Iranian people go out in large numbers and they do vote, despite all of the difficulties with these votes, despite the fact that these are by no measurement fair elections, but when they do, their voice is extremely clear. They're constantly moving the country in the opposite direction, in a much more moderate direction. There's been a tremendous fear on the American side, as well as the European side, on betting on the Iranian people, because the belief is that the Iranian moderates are just not strong enough, they perpetually lose battles, etc. But I also think we should now be quite clear of what the risk is if we ignore Iranian society. When we ignore Iranian society, that's when we're completely shocked that Rouhani won the election. No one in the US government called it. Despite the fact that we put so many resources on following Iran, no one called it. And they were completely surprised by it, because our analysis has been so centric on the regime at the expense of the society. And the society has won significant victories. The victory of Rouhani's election itself is, in the eyes of many, the victory of the Green Movement that was suppressed 4 years earlier. When Rouhani was elected, people were going around with signs and singing slogans in Tehran saying, "Didn't I tell you I would get my vote back?" Because remember, in 2009, the slogan was, "Where's my vote? You stole my vote." 2013, they said, "I got my vote back, and I told you that would happen." When you had the situation in Egypt when the counter coup, when Morsi was set aside, and in one day, I think roughly 1,300 people were killed in Cairo. And Cairo was burning. I thought it was interesting seeing how Iranians who were very close to the reform movement were putting up pictures on their Facebook of a picture of Cairo burning. And underneath it said revolution. And then it was pictures of young Iranians dancing in the streets celebrating Rouhani's election victory. And underneath that it said reform, evolution. That's the conclusion they have gotten based on the fact that, unlike Egypt, they actually had a revolution 35 years ago, and they pretty much regret it. They pretty much regret the fact that when you go down that path and you cannot control the political process, you probably end up in a worse situation. That's exactly what they did. The slogans at Tahrir Square were almost identical to the slogans in Tehran 1979, because the focus was on who had to go, whether it was the Shah or Mubarak. There was not much of a focus of who has to come. And in both places, they probably figured out afterwards that that's probably not a sufficient strategy. But the Iranians had that 35 years ago, so now they're much more careful. They don't go down that path as easily. Instead, they're pursuing a strategy that I know may be difficult for us to grasp. It's called patience. It's one in which if you cannot create opportunities of your own, you wait for an opportunity to emerge. And when it emerges, you grab it. And that's exactly what they've done.
Thank you.
Thank you again for coming today. Is it not true that really, if we go back and look at the nuclear or the quote-unquote nuclear crisis, that the LR1 and the LR6 centrifuges were never subjected to spin to a degree of going toward nuclear weaponry, that they were suppressed always at 20% or below, and that this was clearly a manufactured crisis, if you will, throughout the region and throughout the United States, perhaps even within the triad of Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, and that nothing was ever grounded in those tenets of science, and that finally this nuclear deal has ellipsed into that, and it will start to expose that type of international behavior.
Thank you. It is true that they never enrich uranium above 20%. And you need 93% or so in order to be able to build bombs. I wouldn't entirely buy into the terminology of saying that it's a manufactured crisis, because that would indicate that there is no basis at all for it. I think there is a basis. Is it highly exaggerated? Has it been blown out of proportion? Yes, without a doubt. But it's been done so by many sides, not just by the Western side. The Iranians also did the same thing. For the Iranians, you got to think about this. Here you have Iran getting 6 major countries, 5 of them, wielding vetoes in the Security Council, coming and negotiating with them. They needed a crisis to be able to bring the great powers to the negotiating table. So all sides at times have fanned the flames, exaggerated the crisis, and at times have found it to be problematic for them. It's not one-sided. But at the basis of it, there is a conflict. At the basis, this is not taken completely out of thin air. And the Iranians had great difficulties being able to show what they had done prior to 2003, and the solution that ended up coming is that the IAEA made an investigation, they got access, but their conclusion was inconclusive. But the agreement said that the deal is not dependent upon the conclusion of the investigation of Iran's prior activities. It's only dependent upon the fact that the Iranians have to give the IAEA access so that it satisfies their questions. That's it. And that's what happened. Satisfied their question, but there wasn't necessarily a real answer. The issue was, you can't dwell on the past. You have to make sure. It's more important to make sure that there is no bomb making in the future than to make sure that there was no bomb making in the past. If you could wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Travis Delaney. I'm an undergraduate student here. I'm about to graduate.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Hi, I'm Travis Delaney. I'm an undergrad here. Hi, I'm Travis Delaney. I'm an undergrad here at UMass Boston. I'm about to graduate next month. And my question, I just got back from another lecture series a couple hours ago, and the guy was speaking about, American foreign policy in the Middle East since the 1980s, and basically his whole thing was, how America has gotten itself involved in all these conflicts in the Middle East, and he basically said that there was basically no end in sight, and that, up until now, with the Iran nuclear deal, he said that's very much up for grabs, regarding our election, and how, depending on who becomes president, he says if, Donald Trump or either Ted Cruz becomes president, especially Ted Cruz, he said the first thing he's going to do, day one in his office is going to rip apart this whole Iran nuclear deal, and is going to, is going to defend Israel. So I wanted to ask you what your view on that is, because a lot of members, on the Republican side, have also stated, that they want to rip this entire deal up, and I'm very concerned, that if that happens, that that America is going to get itself involved in another Middle East war that's going to make, you know, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars look like a cakewalk.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Sorry? I can't hear you. Oh, Andrew. Okay. Oh, fantastic. All right. For Ted Cruz to rip it apart, he first needs to win the presidency. So I'll set that one aside for a moment. The deal is vulnerable, without a doubt. And I think the next 9 months are absolutely critical. If implementation in the next 9 months goes quite well, and right now the problem, unfortunately, is on the American side, because the IAEA has confirmed that the Iranians have done what they're supposed to be doing. The United States has technically lifted the sanctions, but because of so many different fears and confusions, the banks are still not underwriting any of the projects, and the Europeans are going to Iran, signing deals, but they can't get any financing for it because the banks, for a variety of reasons, are looking at what's coming out of the presidential election rhetoric and are very worried that this deal is going to be undone, and as a result, they're not actually implementing it. But if it is implemented, it can lead to a scenario in which it is so cemented so that the next president, whether he or she wants to or not, actually really cannot undo it. If it remains problematic in the sense that there's complaints from various sides that things are not being implemented appropriately, the Europeans are actually quite upset with the United States right now because their sanctions are lifted, but the banks are still not getting the guarantees that they want in order to be able to go in and do the financing. If that situation continues, then the deal is very vulnerable. And then it's not just whether a president would want to undo it. The question is, would the pressures that are waiting to pressure the next president to undo it, will it be so strong that the next president will not be able to withstand those, even if he or she actually wants to protect the deal? Now, in the case of Hillary Clinton, she has defended the deal, and she has also taken credit for the deal for some of her involvement in it. I've seen no indication that she would have the intent of not defending it. I am concerned, however, that the language, et cetera, that she's using is indicating that she's only going to defend the deal and protect the deal, but she's not going to see if the opening with Iran actually can be further widened, if the window of opportunity can be further explored. And I find that highly problematic because I think a status quo between the United States and Iran is a net negative for the durability of the deal. Meaning, for the durability of the deal to be secured, U.S.-Iran relations need to have at least a slightly positive trajectory going forward. Because the challenges to the deal are going to keep on coming, and unless you strengthen the relationship, at some point, the deal is going to falter. And if you then come in with the intent of saying, well, I'm not going to move an inch beyond the deal, I'm not going to explore these other things, which I think some of her rhetoric has suggested, then that in and of itself could be a negative for the deal. Now, of course, we all know it's all election rhetoric at this point. Things change when they come in. You all may remember that George W. Bush ran as an anti-interventionist, and we all know how that ended up. So we should be careful not to draw too big of a conclusion based solely on what they've been saying so far in the campaigns.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name's Corey, recent graduate from the program. What you spoke about today was largely, I would say, strategic, political. So I was hoping you'd spend some time talking about the personal aspect of what happened. What relationships did Secretary Kerry, President Rouhani, Minister Zarif develop, and how important were those in moving forward? Because we do see so often that even when strategies line up, you need a personal push to really get some stuff done.
Absolutely. Excellent question. It's quite fascinating. Prior to Rouhani's election, the negotiating team under Ahmadinejad, the negotiating team that was doing the official negotiations with the P5+1, essentially were on the instructions of not yielding an inch until there was movement on enrichment. And they were quite nervous about interactions between the two sides. So for instance, when the P5+1 meetings were taking place, the Iranians insisted that the P5+1 diplomats would all have to come in at once, together, sit down, and when everyone is seated, that's when the Iranian delegation would march in and come to their seats. And when the negotiations were over, everyone should still be sitting. The Iranians needed to leave first, leave the room, and then the others could stand up, just to make sure that there were no conversations over coffee or anything like that. It was really not much of a functioning negotiation. It was important because if there wasn't an ongoing diplomatic process, however inefficient or unproductive, the pressure for military action would probably have grown even more. You needed to have an ongoing diplomatic process in order to be able to push back against that. Once the teams changed and the US side indicated that they could accept some enrichment, and then Rouhani came in with a very different team, long experience in the United States, most of them having done their degrees in the US, a lot of exposure to the US, it changed dramatically. The language of the negotiations shifted over to English. All of these silly rules of not sitting next to each other and things like that were changed. And over a course of time, you could see that a personal rapport started to be built, particularly, but not exclusively, but particularly between John Kerry and Javad Zarif. Without saying too much, I can say that some in the negotiations team explained that by saying that both Zarif and Kerry tend to be big picture people. And they were looking at this as a necessary step for a much, much larger objective that has to do with the geopolitics of the Middle East, the standing of the United States, but also what is going to be the future of Iran. If a deal can be struck by the United States, then there can be a future of Iran that is not defining itself against the United States all the time. If the moderates in Iran can show that diplomacy pays off, that could give them a significant boost politically. And moderate policies could also be pursued. Negotiations could also be pursued in many other areas. But up until that point, moderates in Iran didn't have much to show for. They had made a lot of attempts. They even collaborated with the United States in 2001 against the Taliban, but got nothing for it. They got axis of evil for it. They needed a win to be able to showcase that diplomacy and a moderate approach to the world, not one of slogans and confrontation, actually is better for Iran's national interest. There's been a flip side of this as well, which is that the relationship between Zarif and Kerry has become so strong and so important that the current state of US-Iran relations is very much centered on these two individuals. And Kerry's not going to be around for more than another 9 months maximum, and we don't know about Zarif's political future. We've not seen a situation in which the movement and the improvement in relations actually has been institutionalized. So that it's at several different levels in the governments, not centered on individuals alone. Okay.
Hello, my name is Makis. Thank you for coming. You spoke about the changes that can occur in Israel and Saudi Arabia, but in case this deal succeeds, how will this impact the security situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan with the rise of ISIS and the continued Taliban offenses?
Sure.
Thank you.
Very good question. I think Afghanistan is a perfect example of how the absence of an understanding between the United States and Iran tended to make existing conflicts even more difficult to resolve. In 2001, after 9/11, the United States and Iran actually started collaborating very extensively under George Bush behind the scenes against the Taliban. The Iranians had been the main backers of the Northern Alliance, who had been the only element left that the Taliban had not managed to take by then. The Taliban controlled almost 90%, or a little bit more, 90% of the country at the time. And behind the scenes, they worked together. From the Iranian perspective, this was partly aimed at showing the strategic utility that the United States would gain by having a different relationship with Iran. It culminated in the Bonn conference in 2001, in December, in which the US and Iran coordinated the conference and ensured that the Afghans came to an agreement on a new constitution. According to the US envoy at the time for President Bush, the Iranians played a pivotal role. The peace would not have been won had it not been for the Iranians. And incidentally, was Javad Zarif in that negotiation as well, precisely because of the decade-long relationship they had with the Northern Alliance. 6 weeks later, George Bush puts them in the axis of evil. And what had been a cooperative relationship in Afghanistan, because both sides opposed the Taliban, quickly turned into a competitive relationship in which Afghanistan became another arena for the United States and Iran to compete with each other, at the expense, of course, of the people of Afghanistan. There's no guarantees that at this point, and the reason for this is even though they continue to have common interests there, that was a lesser priority compared to the fear that the Iranians had that the US objective was to do regime change in Iran, meaning that if the US was successful in Iraq and in Afghanistan, Iran would be next. So they drew the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that for their own regime security, the US could not be allowed to succeed in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And even though they started off collaborating there, because of the regime change fear, it ended up becoming quite the opposite, and the US and Iran undermined each other in Afghanistan. Now, with this deal, and if it can expand to go beyond just a nuclear issue, there are reasons to believe that actually Afghanistan might be one of the first, the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to the US and Iran finding common ground, being able to collaborate, and make sure that at a minimum, if they don't have the capacity to resolve the conflict, they don't make it worse. We see that in Syria, for instance. US and Iran alone do not have the capacity of ending this carnage in Syria. But if they're not undermining each other, at least they're not contributing to prolonging that conflict.
Can you say something about the role of religion as Iran evolves toward the West, not toward the West, more regionally involved, less? What's the role of religion both within the country and in the surround?
Thank you. I think folks would probably end up being a little bit surprised to find out that despite the fact that Iran is an Islamic republic formally, and despite the fact that obviously religion does play a role in Iranian society, and probably more so than in most Western countries, Iran is still a surprisingly secular country for most Westerners when they travel there. And that's actually a long tradition. It's not a recent phenomenon. My own work on Iranian foreign policy have left me with the conclusion that religion actually plays a shockingly small role in the formulation of Iranian foreign policy. This regime is far more Machiavellian than it is religious. It is quite astute at putting its geostrategically motivated decisions in religious language and presenting it something that is motivated by religion, whereas in reality it is not. But they need religion as a legitimizing factor precisely because of the fact that their foreign policy is not, because of the Iranian ambition to be a major player in the region, they have to have an ideology, their calculation is, in order to be able to make what otherwise are decisions aimed at maximizing Iranian power become attractive for populations outside of Iran. Let me explain that a little bit more in detail. Take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for instance. Without a doubt, the sympathies on the Iranian side are deeply with the Palestinian side. But most of their decisions in regards to this, on Israel and Palestine, has been motivated by a desire for Iran to be a regional powerhouse. And for achieving that, they have to overcome two major problems that they have in the region. One is to overcome the Sunni-Shia divide, and one is to overcome the Arab-Persian divide. The answer of Ayatollah Khomeini for that was political Islam. An Islamic ideology that did not recognize these type of borders, that did not recognize these other constructs, in order to give the Iranians, as non-Arabs and non-Sunnis, an ability to claim leadership in the region. So when Yasser Arafat, 10 days after the revolution in 1979, unannounced and uninvited, shows up in Tehran with a delegation of about 40 people from the PLO, and the revolutionaries are a complete disarray. It's a revolution, so it's not particularly well organized. They drive him immediately from the airport to see Ayatollah Khomeini, and Arafat and Khomeini have a 2-hour meeting. That was a complete disaster. They really, really did not like each other. Khomeini was lecturing Arafat and saying that you made such a big mistake because you're pursuing this Palestinian struggle as an Arab nationalist struggle. It has to be an Islamic struggle. Arafat, who didn't care much for religion at all, was completely unmoved and quite insulted. I mean, he was Arafat. He's like a semi-god in the region at the time. And who is this Khomeini? He's been running a country for 10 days. That's it. But the reason why Khomeini did this is because if you want to be seen as a leader in the region, and if the most important issue, or let me put it, the conflict in the region that touches everyone is the Israeli-Palestinian one, how can you be a leader of the region if that conflict is defined as an Arab nationalist cause and you are a non-Arab country? How can you be a leader that also has a leadership on that issue if you're a Shia power and this, if it even were to become a religious issue, it would be a Sunni issue, not a Shia issue? He needed to redefine, and he did a lot, to turn the Palestinian cause into a religious cause for the sole reason of giving Iran a say in it, not for the reason of actually fixing it. And this explains a lot as to why the Iranians had a very strong, venomous rhetoric against the Israeli state. Arafat was very unhappy because he believed that there had been promises that the Palestinians would get a lot of support from the Iranians, which they did not. All they got was a lot of slogans. And in one specific moment, when Arafat was very unhappy and had given some very sharp criticism against Khomeini and also sided with Saddam Hussein in the Iraq-Iran war, the Iranians felt that their pro-Palestinian bona fides were under threat. So what did they do? Well, they didn't send money or arms to Arafat. They put on a new parade in Tehran called Jerusalem Day. And they paraded through Tehran streets for the right of the Palestinians to get Jerusalem back. It's at that very parade that 25 years later, Ahmadinejad misquotes Khomeini, and then the media mistranslates it to say wipe Israel off the map, whereas in reality, what he said in Persian did not include the word map, did not include the word Israel, did not include the word wipe out. But it was at that rally that had been established in 1981 to cover up the fact that the Iranians were not actually doing that much to help the Palestinians. But they needed these different things, and they used religion in order to make what otherwise is a pretty nationalistic Iranian foreign policy attractive for non-Iranians. On the Israeli side, incidentally, you're seeing pretty much the same thing. They like that frame. Because if the frame is that this is an Islamic issue, then what is Israel? Well, Israel is then a liberal Western democracy. And if this issue is defined as a struggle between Islamists and a Western liberal democracy, where will the allegiances of the Western states be? Is there even a question about that? One last question?
I'm Adam Green. Question about the proposition, I think stated by the president, maybe by others, that in the case of a breach, that sanctions could snap back. So my question is about the use of the phrase snap back. What do you think of that in terms of its A, accuracy, and B, the sincerity of saying it?
Interesting question. Accuracy. Well, a lot of terminology that was used was not necessarily very accurate, or at least it could be interpreted in different ways. It's not going to be snapback in the sense that if there is a violation, automatically, without a decision, sanctions are snapped back. And the reason for that is twofold. First, you need to make sure that if there is a breach, the sanctions that are put back into place or snapped back are proportionate. Because if you want to have a correction to make sure that the deal survives, you cannot suddenly put back all of the past sanctions if there was a minor breach. You need to make sure that the response is proportionate. Otherwise, you are killing the deal. So there couldn't be an automatic snapback. There needed to be at least a moment of reflection in the middle of that battle. Secondly, the Russians in particular, for reasons that have nothing to do with this, reasons that actually have more to do with what happened with Iraq in 1998, have made a principle out of making sure that there are no decisions made by the Security Council that creates automaticity for a future decision, meaning that the future decision has to be deliberated, because the Russians want to always make sure that they have the ability to use their veto if they're opposed to it. And this actually has to do with the way that the Security Council resolutions back in the 1990s did not clarify in very clear language that if Saddam Hussein was not living up to whatever requirements were, that the issue would go back to the Security Council for the Security Council to make a decision of what to do. The US side interpreted it as, well, that means that we have freedom to go bomb them, and that's exactly what Clinton did in 1998. I actually worked in the Security Council at the time I was in those meetings, and the Russians were absolutely furious. And ever since, they've never permitted a Security Council resolution to pass unless it's said very explicitly that the decision has to go back to the Council for an additional decision. The issue has to go back for an additional decision. Now, does that mean that there isn't a measurement to be able to make sure that if there is a breach, there will be punishment? Not at all. If there is a breach, rest assured, there is going to be consequences for the Iranians. The issue, though, is that the folks who made this deal really have a vested interest in making sure that the deal works, and as a result are not putting into place measures that in and of themselves actually would kill the deal. If there is a minor escalation here, it would be an escalation, a minor violation here, there wouldn't be an escalation that would then ultimately see the deal fall apart.
Hello, my name is Michelle, and I'm an undergrad, and I am wondering what effect it would have if I redesigned a nuclear facility that would be a push-the-envelope type of design, flawless, of amplifying uranium.
Sorry, could you repeat that? There's some folks having great fun in the other room. I can hardly hear you.
If I've designed, push the envelope, designed a nuclear facility that would be a lockout for amplifying uranium, would that put a hold on like any amplifying it for the atomic stuff? If the design were, say, concrete?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, and I'm not sure I fully heard it right. But if the question is if they were to do different designs of the centrifuge, et cetera, if at some point that actually would be a violation of the deal, is that?
Well, no, if the design were redesigned to where it would concretely stop the centrifuge process to a functional power out of a littler bit of uranium and making a little bit much more powerful for just a concrete purpose, and it doesn't go any further than that, and there is no need to make any more until...
Okay. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but my understanding, though, is that it has more to do with how you configure the cascades of centrifuges that decides to what degree they get enriched. Now, obviously, if you have more advanced centrifuges that break down less, spin faster, et cetera, you can achieve other things. But the early parts of the negotiations actually were not, the conversation was based on how the Iranians would configure the cascades that would make it impossible for them to use it for bomb making, rather than drastically reducing the number of centrifuges. That plan eventually ended up being rejected by both sides, and they went for a different plan in which the red line of the president was very clear. He didn't care that much about the specific numbers of centrifuges or the specific amount of LEU. The combination, however, would not be permitted to allow for a breakout capability less than 12 months. That was critical for the president. And every iteration of the deal, every change that was made was overnight sent to a lab in the United States with nuclear physicists that had rebuilt the Iranian nuclear facilities. They tested it to see if there was any way for the Iranians to cheat. And if there wasn't, they sent back their okay to the president. So at the core of this was a very, very solid scientific basis in which everything that was agreed upon, the US actually tested at a mock site that was built exactly like the Iranian Natanz facility. I hope that answered the question.
That's concrete.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, my thanks to Dr. Parsi. So we're rounding up. I just want to have a couple of quick announcements. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge Adam Green. This is Ben Slomoff's grandson, who's come all the way from New York to join us today. Please. That's a long way to come for one night. Please give Ben our thanks and our love. Thank you. Second is all that cheering you heard outside is certainly just preparation for our party, which is starting right now. One floor down at the faculty staff dining room, which is just below us, literally one floor. You'll see us all heading in that direction down that way. You're all invited. Please come by. You'll get a chance to hang out with Dr. Parsi a little bit more if you have some more questions for him. And David Matz will be there as well, and the rest of us too. So I really hope you will join us. Last but not least, my thanks to all of you for coming out and joining us this evening. I want to, again, thank you for your engagement in all that we do in the department, and I want to encourage you to stay engaged, and I look forward to seeing you downstairs. Thanks so much.